Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 34. Malevola. Madame Beck called me on Thursday afternoon and asked whether I had any occupation to hinder me from going into town and executing some little commissions for her at the shops. Being disengaged, and placing myself at her service, I was presently furnished with a list of the wools, silks, embroidering thread, etc., wanted in the pupil's work, and having equipped myself in a manner suiting the threatening aspect of a cloudy and sultry day, I was just drawing the spring-bolt of the street door, and act to issue forth, when Madame's voice again summoned me to the salle à manger. "Pardon, Meess Lucy," cried she, in the seeming haste of an impromptu thought, "I have just recollected one more errand for you, if your good nature will not deem itself overburdened." Of course I confounded myself in asseverations to the contrary, and Madame, running into the little salon, brought thence a pretty basket, filled with fine hothouse fruit, rosy, perfect, and tempting, reposing amongst the dark green, wax-like leaves, and pale yellow stars of I knew not what exotic plant. "There," she said, "it is not heavy, and will not shame your neat toilette as if it were a household, servant-like detail. Do me the favour to leave this little basket at the house of Madame Walraven's, with my felicitations on her fête. She lives down in the old town, Numéro 3, Rue des Mages. I fear you will find the walk rather long, but you have the whole afternoon before you, and do not hurry. If you are not back in time for dinner, I will order a portion to be saved, or Goton, with whom you are a favourite, will have pleasure in tossing up some trifle for your especial benefit. You shall not be forgotten, ma bonne Meess, and oh, please," calling me back once more, "be sure to insist on seeing Madame Walravens herself, and giving the basket into her own hands, in order that there may be no mistake, for she is rather a punctilious personage. Adieu! Au revoir!" And at last I got away. The shop commissions took some time to execute, that choosing and matching of silks and wools being always a tedious business, but at last I got through my list. The patterns for the slippers, and the bell ropes, the cabas were selected, the slides and tassels for the purses chosen, the whole tripotage, in short, was off my mind, nothing but the fruit, and the felicitations remained to be attended to. I rather liked the prospect of a long walk, deep into the old and grim Basseville, and I liked it no worse because the evening sky, over the city, was settling into a mass of black-blue metal, heated at the rim, and inflaming slowly to a heavy red. I fear a high wind, because storm demands that exertion of strength and use of action I always yield with pain, but the sullen downfall, the thick snow descent, or dark rush of rain, ask only resignation, the quiet abandonment of garments and person to be drenched. In return, it sweeps a great capital clean before you, it makes you a quiet path through broad grand streets, it petrifies a living city as if by eastern enchantment, it transforms a Villette into a Tadmor. Let, then, the rains fall, and the floods descend, only I must first get rid of this basket of fruit. An unknown clock from an unknown tower, Jean Baptiste's voice was now too distant to be audible, was tolling the 3/4 past 5, when I reached that street and house whereof Madame Beck had given me the address. It was no street at all, it seemed rather to be part of a square. It was quiet. Grass grew between the broad grey flags. The houses were large, and looked very old. Behind them rose the appearance of trees, indicating gardens at the back. Antiquity brooded above this region, business was banished thence. Rich men had once possessed this quarter, and once grandeur had made her seat here. That church, whose dark, half-ruinous turrets overlooked the square, was the venerable and formerly opulent shrine of the Magi. But wealth and greatness had long since stretched their gilded pinions and fled hence, leaving these their ancient nests, perhaps to house penury for a time, or perhaps to stand cold and empty, mouldering untenanted in the course of winters. As I crossed this deserted place, on whose pavement drops almost as large as a 5-franc piece were now slowly darkening, I saw, in its whole expanse, no symptom or evidence of life, except what was given in the figure of an infirm old priest, who went past, bending and propped on a staff, the type of eld and decay. He had issued from the very house to which I was directed, and when I paused before the door just closed after him, and rang the bell, he turned to look at me. Nor did he soon avert his gaze. Perhaps he thought me, with my basket of summer fruit, and my lack of the dignity age confers, an incongruous figure in such a scene. I know, had a young, ruddy-faced bonne opened the door to admit me, I should have thought such a one little in harmony with her dwelling, but, when I found myself confronted by a very old woman, wearing a very antique peasant costume, a cap alike hideous and costly, with long flaps of native lace, a petticoat and jacket of cloth, and sabots more like little boats than shoes, it seemed all right, and soothingly in character. The expression of her face was not quite so soothing as the cut of her costume. Anything more cantankerous I have seldom seen. She would scarcely reply to my inquiry after Madame Walraven's. I believe she would have snatched the basket of fruit from my hand, had not the old priest, hobbling up, checked her, and himself lent an ear to the message with which I was charged. His apparent deafness rendered it a little difficult to make him fully understand that I must see Madame Walravens, and consign the fruit into her own hands. At last, however, he comprehended the fact that such were my orders, and that duty enjoined their literal fulfilment. Addressing the aged bonne, not in French, but in the aboriginal tongue of Labassecoeur, he persuaded her, at last, to let me cross the inhospitable threshold, and himself escorting me upstairs, I was ushered into a sort of salon, and there left. The room was large, and had a fine old ceiling, and almost church-like windows of coloured glass, but it was desolate, and in the shadow of a coming storm looked strangely lowering. Within, opened a smaller room. There, however, the blind of the single casement was closed. Through the deep gloom few details of furniture were apparent. These few I amused myself by puzzling to make out, and in particular I was attracted by the outline of a picture on the wall. By and by the picture seemed to give way. To my bewilderment it shook, it sunk, it rolled back into nothing. Its vanishing left an opening arched, leading into an arched passage, with a mystic winding stair. Both passage and stair were of cold stone, uncarpeted and unpainted. Down this donjon stair descended a tap, tap, like a stick. Soon there fell on the steps a shadow, and last of all I was aware of a substance. Yet, was it actual substance, this appearance approaching me, this obstruction partially darkening the arch? It drew near, and I saw it well. I began to comprehend where I was. Well might this old square be named Quarter of the Magi. Well might the 3 towers overlooking it own for godfathers 3 mystic sages of a dead and dark art. Hoar enchantment here prevailed. A spell had opened for me elfland. That cell-like room, that vanishing picture, that arch and passage and stair of stone, were all parts of a fairy tale. Distincter even than these scenic details stood the chief figure, Cunegonde, the sorceress, Malevola, the evil fairy. How was she? She might be 3 feet high, but she had no shape. Her skinny hands rested upon each other, and pressed the gold knob of a wand-like ivory staff. Her face was large, set not upon her shoulders, but before her breast. She seemed to have no neck. I should have said there were 100 years in her features, and more perhaps in her eyes, her malign, unfriendly eyes, with thick grey brows above, and livid lids all round. How severely they viewed me, with a sort of dull displeasure. This being wore a gown of brocade, dyed bright blue, full tinted as the gentianella flower, and covered with satin foliage in a large pattern. Over the gown a costly shawl, gorgeously bordered, and so large for her that its many-coloured fringe swept the floor. But her chief points were her jewels. She had long, clear earrings, blazing with a lustre which could not be borrowed or false. She had rings on her skeleton hands, with thick gold hoops, and stones, purple, green, and blood-red. Hunchbacked, dwarfish, and doting, she was adorned like a barbarian queen. "Que voulez-vous?" said she, hoarsely, with the voice rather of male than of female old age, and indeed a silver beard bristled her chin. I delivered my basket and my message. "Is that all?" she demanded. "It is all," said I.
"Truly, it was well worth while," she answered. "Return to Madame Beck, and tell her I can buy fruit when I want it, et quant à ses félicitations, je m'en moque."
And this courteous dame turned her back. Just as she turned, a peal of thunder broke, and a flash of lightning blazed broad over salon and boudoir. The tale of magic seemed to proceed with due accompaniment of the elements. The wanderer, decoyed into the enchanted castle, heard rising, outside, the spell-wakened tempest. What, in all of this, was I to think of Madame Beck? She owned strange acquaintance. She offered messages and gifts at a unique shrine, and inauspicious seemed the bearing of the uncouth thing she worshipped. There went that sullen Sidonia, tottering and trembling like palsy incarnate, tapping her ivory staff on the mosaic parquet, and muttering venomously as she vanished. Down washed the rain, deep lowered the welkin. The clouds, ruddy a while ago, had now, through all their blackness, turned deadly pale, as if in terror. Notwithstanding my late boast about not fearing a shower, I hardly liked to go out under this waterspout. Then the gleams of lightning were very fierce, the thunder crashed very near. This storm had gathered immediately above Villette. It seemed to have burst at the zenith. It rushed down prone, the forked, slanted bolts pierced athwart vertical torrents. Red zigzags interlaced a descent blanched as white metal, and all broke from a sky heavily black in its swollen abundance. Leaving Madame Walraven's inhospitable salon, I betook myself to her cold staircase. There was a seat on the landing. There I waited. Somebody came gliding along the gallery just above. It was the old priest. "Indeed, mademoiselle shall not sit there," said he. "It would displeasure our benefactor if he knew a stranger was so treated in this house." And he begged me so earnestly to return to the salon, that without discourtesy I could not but comply. The smaller room was better furnished and more habitable than the larger. Thither he introduced me. Partly withdrawing the blind, he disclosed what seemed more like an oratory than a boudoir, a very solemn little chamber, looking as if it were a place rather dedicated to relics and remembrance, than designed for present use and comfort. The good father sat down, as if to keep me company, but instead of conversing he took out a book, fastened on the page his eyes, and employed his lips in whispering, what sounded like a prayer or litany. A yellow electric light from the sky gilded his bald head. His figure remained in shade, deep and purple. He sat still as sculpture. He seemed to forget me for his prayers. He only looked up when a fiercer bolt, or a harsher, closer rattle told of nearing danger. Even then, it was not in fear, but in seeming awe he raised his eyes. I too was awestruck. Being, however, under no pressure of slavish terror, my thoughts and observations were free. To speak truth, I was beginning to fancy that the old priest resembled that Père Silas before whom I had kneeled in the church of the Béguinage. The idea was vague, for I had seen my confessor only in dusk and in profile, yet still I seemed to trace a likeness. I thought also I recognized the voice. While I watched him, he betrayed by one lifted look that he felt my scrutiny. I turned to note the room, that too had its half-mystic interest. Beside a cross of curiously carved old ivory, yellow with time, and sloped above a dark red prie-dieu, furnished duly with rich missal and ebon rosary, hung the picture whose dim outline had drawn my eyes before, the picture which moved, fell away with the wall and let in phantoms. Imperfectly seen, I had taken it for a Madonna. Revealed by clearer light, it proved to be a woman's portrait in a nun's dress. The face, though not beautiful, was pleasing, pale, young, and shaded with the dejection of grief or ill health. I say again, it was not beautiful, it was not even intellectual. Its very amiability was the amiability of a weak frame, inactive passions, acquiescent habits. Yet I looked long at that picture, and could not choose but look. The old priest, who at first had seemed to me so deaf and infirm, must yet have retained his faculties in tolerable preservation. Absorbed in his book as he appeared, without once lifting his head, or, as far as I knew, turning his eyes, he perceived the point towards which my attention was drawn, and in a slow distinct voice, dropped, concerning it, these 4 observations. "She was much beloved. She gave herself to God. She died young.
She is still remembered, still wept.
"By that aged lady, Madame Walravens?" I inquired, fancying that I had discovered in the incurable grief of bereavement a key to that same aged lady's desperate ill-humour.
The father shook his head with half a smile. "No, no," said he, "a grande dame's affection for her children's children may be great, and her sorrow for their loss lively, but it is only the affianced lover, to whom fate, faith, and death have trebly denied the bliss of union, who mourns what he has lost, as Justine Marie is still mourned."
I thought the father rather wished to be questioned, and therefore I inquired who had lost and who still mourned Justine Marie. I got in reply quite a little romantic narrative, told not unimpressively, with the accompaniment of the now subsiding storm. I am bound to say it might have been much more truly impressive if there had been less French, Rousseau-like sentimentalizing and wire-drawing, and rather more healthful carelessness of effect. But the worthy father was obviously a Frenchman born and bred. I became more and more persuaded of his resemblance to my confessor. He was a true son of Rome. When he did lift his eyes, he looked at me out of their corners, with more and sharper subtlety than, one would have thought, could survive the wear and tear of 70 years. Yet, I believe, he was a good old man. The hero of his tale was some former pupil of his whom he now called his benefactor, and who, it appears, had loved this pale Justine Marie, the daughter of rich parents, at a time when his own worldly prospects were such as to justify his aspiring to a well-dowered hand. The pupil's father, once a rich banker, had failed, died, and left behind him only debts and destitution. The son was then forbidden to think of Marie, especially that old witch of a grandame I had seen, Madame Walravens, opposed the match with all the violence of a temper which deformity made sometimes demoniac. The mild Marie had neither the treachery to be false, nor the force to be quite staunch to her lover. She gave up her first suitor, but refusing to accept a second with a heavier purse, withdrew to a convent, and there died in her novitiate. Lasting anguish, it seems, had taken possession of the faithful heart which worshipped her, and the truth of that love and grief had been shown in a manner which touched even me as I listened. Some years after Justine Marie's death, ruin had come on her house too. Her father, by nominal calling a jeweller, but who also dealt a good deal on the Bourse, had been concerned in some financial transactions which entailed exposure and ruinous fines. He died of grief for the loss and shame for the infamy. His old hunchbacked mother and his bereaved wife were left penniless, and might have died too of want, but their lost daughter's once despised yet most true-hearted suitor, hearing of the condition of these ladies, came with singular devotedness to the rescue. He took on their insolent pride the revenge of the purest charity, housing, caring for, befriending them, so as no son could have done it more tenderly and efficiently. The mother, on the whole a good woman, died blessing him. The strange, godless, loveless, misanthrope grandmother lived still, entirely supported by this self-sacrificing man. Her, who had been the bane of his life, blighting his hope and awarding him, for love and domestic happiness, long mourning and cheerless solitude, he treated with the respect a good son might offer a kind mother. He had brought her to this house, and, continued the priest, while genuine tears rose to his eyes, here too he shelters me, his old tutor, and Agnes, a superannuated servant of his father's family. To our sustenance, and to other charities, I know he devotes 3 parts of his income, keeping only the 4th to provide himself with bread and the most modest accommodations. By this arrangement he has rendered it impossible to himself ever marry. He has given himself to God, and to his angel bride, as much as if he were a priest, like me." The father had wiped away his tears before he uttered these last words, and pronouncing them, he for one instant raised his eyes to mine. I caught this glance. Despite its veiled character, the momentary gleam shot a meaning which struck me. "These Romanists are strange beings. Such a one among them, whom you know no more than the last Inca of Peru or the first Emperor of China, knows you and all your concerns, and has his reasons for saying to you so and so, when you simply thought the communication sprang impromptu from the instant's impulse, his plan in bringing it about that you shall come on such a day, to such a place, under such and such circumstances, when the whole arrangement seems to your crude apprehension the ordinance of chance, or the sequel of exigency. Madame Beck's suddenly recollected message and present, my artless embassy to the place of the Magi, the old priest accidentally descending the steps and crossing the square, his interposition on my behalf with the bonne who would have sent me away, his reappearance on the staircase, my introduction to this room, the portrait, the narrative so affably volunteered, all these little incidents, taken as they fell out, seemed each independent of its successor, a handful of loose beads, but threaded through by that quick shot and crafty glance of a Jesuit eye, they dropped pendant in a long string, like that rosary on the prie-dieu. Where lay the link of junction, where the little clasp of this monastic necklace? I saw or felt union, but could not yet find the spot, or detect the means of connection. Perhaps the musing fit into which I had by this time fallen appeared somewhat suspicious in its abstraction. He gently interrupted. "Mademoiselle," said he, "I trust you have not far to go through these inundated streets?" "More than half a league." "You live?" "In the Rue Fossette." "Not," with animation, "not at the pensionnat of Madame Beck?" "The same." "Donc," clapping his hands, "donc, vous devez connaître mon noble élève, mon Paul." "Monsieur Paul Emanuel, professor of literature?" "He and none other." A brief silence fell. The spring of junction seemed suddenly to have become palpable. I felt it yield to pressure. "Was it of Monsieur Paul you have been speaking?" I presently inquired. "Was he your pupil, and the benefactor of Madame Walravens?" "Yes, and of Agnes, the old servant, and moreover," with a certain emphasis, "he was and is the lover, true, constant, and eternal, of that saint in heaven, Justine Marie." "And who, father, are you?" I continued, and though I accentuated the question, its utterance was well nigh superfluous. I was ere this quite prepared for the answer which actually came. "I, daughter, am Père Silas, that unworthy son of Holy Church whom you once honoured with a noble and touching confidence, showing me the core of a heart, and the inner shrine of a mind whereof, in solemn truth, I coveted the direction, in behalf of the only true faith. Nor have I for a day lost sight of you, nor for an hour failed to take in you a rooted interest. Passed under the discipline of Rome, moulded by her high training, inoculated with her salutary doctrines, inspired by the zeal she alone gives, I realize what then might be your spiritual rank, your practical value, and I envy heresy her prey." This struck me as a special state of things. I half realized myself in that condition also, passed under discipline, moulded, trained, inoculated, and so on. Not so, thought I, but I restrained deprecation, and sat quietly enough. "I suppose Monsieur Paul does not live here?" I resumed, pursuing a theme which I thought more to the purpose than any wild renegade dreams. "No, he only comes occasionally to worship his beloved saint, to make his confession to me, and to pay his respects to her he calls his mother. His own lodging consists but of 2 rooms. He has no servant, and yet he will not suffer Madame Walravens to dispose of those splendid jewels with which you see her adorned, and in which she takes a puerile pride as the ornaments of her youth and the last relics of her son the jeweller's wealth." How often, murmured I to myself, has this man, this Monsieur Emmanuel, seemed to me to lack magnanimity in trifles, yet how great he is in great things! I own I did not reckon amongst the proofs of his greatness either the act of confession or the saint worship. "How long is it since that lady died?" I inquired, looking at Justine Marie. 20 years. She was somewhat older than Monsieur Emmanuel. He was then very young, for he is not much beyond 40. "Does he yet weep her?" "His heart will weep her always. The essence of Emmanuel's nature is constancy." This was said with marked emphasis. And now the sun broke out pallid and waterish. The rain yet fell, but there was no more tempest. That hot firmament had cloven and poured out its lightnings. A longer delay would scarce leave daylight for my return, so I rose, thanked the father for his hospitality and his tale, was benignantly answered by a pax vobiscum, which I made kindly welcome, because it seemed uttered with a true benevolence, but I liked less the mystic phrase accompanying it. "Daughter, you shall be what you shall be," an oracle that made me shrug my shoulders as soon as I had got outside the door. Few of us know what we are to come to certainly, but for all that had happened yet, I had good hopes of living and dying a sober-minded Protestant. There was a hollowness within, and a flourish around Holy Church, which tempted me but moderately. I went on my way pondering many things. Whatever Romanism may be, there are good Romanists. This man, Emmanuel, seemed of the best, touched with superstition, influenced by priestcraft, yet wondrous for fond faith, for pious devotion, for sacrifice of self, for charity unbounded. It remained to see how Rome, by her agents, handled such qualities, whether she cherished them for their own sake and for God's, or put them out to usury, and made booty of the interest. By the time I reached home it was sundown. Gothon had kindly saved me a portion of dinner, which indeed I needed. She called me into the little cabinet to partake of it, and there Madame Beck soon made her appearance, bringing me a glass of wine. "Well," began she, chuckling, "and what sort of reception did Madame Walravens give you? Elle est drôle, n'est-ce pas?" I told her what had passed, delivering verbatim the courteous message with which I had been charged. "Oh, la singulière petite bosseuse!" laughed she, "et figurez-vous qu'elle me déteste, parce qu'elle me croit amoureuse de mon cousin Paul, ce petit dévot qui n'ose pas bouger, à moins que son confesseur ne lui donne la permission. Au reste," she went on, "if he wanted to marry ever so much, soit moi, soit une autre, he could not do it. He has too large a family already on his hands, Mère Walravens, Père Silas, Dame Agnes, and a whole troop of nameless paupers. There never was a man like him for laying on himself burdens greater than he can bear, voluntarily incurring needless responsibilities. Besides, he harbours a romantic idea about some pale-faced Marie Justine, personnage assez niais à ce que je pense." Such was Madame's irreverent remark, who has been an angel in heaven, or elsewhere, this score of years, and to whom he means to go, free from all earthly ties, pur comme un lit, à ce qu'il dit. Oh, you would laugh, could you but know half Monsieur Emmanuel's crotchets and eccentricities. But I hinder you from taking refreshment, ma bonne Miss, which you must need. Eat your supper, drink your wine, oubliez les anges, les bossus, et surtout les professeurs. Et bonsoir. End of chapter 34. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 35. Fraternity. Oubliez les professeurs. So said Madame Beck. Madame Beck was a wise woman, but she should not have uttered those words. To do so was a mistake. That night she should have left me calm, not excited, indifferent, not interested, isolated in my own estimation and that of others, not connected, even in idea, with this second person whom I was to forget. Forget him? Ah, they took a sage plan to make me forget him, the wise heads. They showed me how good he was. They made of my dear little man a stainless little hero. And then they had prated about his manner of loving. What means had I, before this day, of being certain whether he could love at all or not? I had known him jealous, suspicious. I had seen about him certain tendernesses, fitfulnesses, a softness which came like a warm air, and a ruth which passed like early dew, dried in the heat of his irritabilities. This was all I had seen. And they, Père Silas and Modeste Maria Beck, that these two wrought in concert I could not doubt, opened up the adytum of his heart, showed me one grand love, the child of this southern nature's youth, born so strong and perfect that it had laughed at death himself, despised his mean rape of matter, clung to immortal spirit, and in victory and faith had watched beside a tomb 20 years. This had been done, not idly. This was not a mere hollow indulgence of sentiment. He had proved his fidelity by the consecration of his best energies to an unselfish purpose, and attested it by limitless personal sacrifices, for those once dear to her he prized. He had laid down vengeance, and taken up a cross. Now, as for Justine Marie, I knew what she was as well as if I had seen her. I knew she was well enough. There were girls like her in Madame Beck's school, phlegmatics, pale, slow, inert, but kind-natured, neutral of evil, undistinguished for good. If she wore angel's wings, I knew whose poet fancy conferred them. If her forehead shone luminous with the reflex of a halo, I knew in the fire of whose irids that circlet of holy flame had generated. Was I, then, to be frightened by Justine Marie? Was the picture of a pale dead nun to rise, an eternal barrier? And what of the charities which absorbed his worldly goods? What of his heart sworn to virginity? Madame Beck, Père Silas, you should not have suggested these questions. They were at once the deepest puzzle, the strongest obstruction, and the keenest stimulus I had ever felt. For a week of nights and days I fell asleep, I dreamt, and I woke upon these 2 questions. In the whole world there was no answer to them, except where one dark little man stood, sat, walked, lectured, under the headpiece of a bandit bonnet grec, and within the girth of a sorry paletot, much be-inked, and no little adust. After that visit to the Rue des Mages, I did want to see him again. I felt as if, knowing what I now knew, his countenance would offer a page more lucid, more interesting than ever. I felt a longing to trace in it the imprint of that primitive devotedness, the signs of that half-knightly, half-saintly chivalry which the priest's narrative imputed to his nature. He had become my Christian hero. Under that character I wanted to view him. Nor was opportunity slow to favour. My new impressions underwent her test the next day. Yes, I was granted an interview with my Christian hero, an interview not very heroic, or sentimental, or biblical, but lively enough in its way. About 3 o'clock of the afternoon, the peace of the first class, safely established, as it seemed, under the serene sway of Madame Beck, who, in propria persona, was giving one of her orderly and useful lessons, this peace, I say, suffered a sudden fracture by the wild inburst of a paletot. Nobody at the moment was quieter than myself, eased of responsibility by Madame Beck's presence, soothed by her uniform tones, pleased and edified with her clear exposition of the subject in hand, for she taught well. I sat bent over my desk, drawing, that is, copying an elaborate line engraving, tediously working up my copy to the finish of the original, for that was my practical notion of art, and, strange to say, I took extreme pleasure in the labour, and could even produce curiously finical Chinese facsimiles of steel or mezzotint plates, things about as valuable as so many achievements in worsted work, but I thought pretty well of them in those days. What was the matter? My drawing, my pencils, my precious copy, gathered into one crushed-up handful, perished from before my sight. I myself appeared to be shaken or emptied out of my chair, as a solitary and withered nutmeg might be emptied out of a spice-box by an excited cook. That chair and my desk, seized by the wild paletot, one under each sleeve, were borne afar in a second. I followed the furniture. In 2 minutes they and I were fixed in the centre of the grande salle, a vast adjoining room, seldom used save for dancing and choral singing lessons, fixed with an emphasis which seemed to prohibit the remotest hope of our ever being permitted to stir thence again. Having partially collected my scared wits, I found myself in the presence of 2 men, gentlemen, I suppose I should say, one dark, the other light, one having a stiff, half-military air, and wearing a braided surtout, the other partaking, in garb and bearing, more of the careless aspect of the student or artist class, both flourishing in full magnificence of moustaches, whiskers, and imperial. Monsieur Emmanuel stood a little apart from these. His countenance and eyes expressed strong choler.
He held forth his hand with his tribune gesture. "Mademoiselle," said he, "your business is to prove to these gentlemen that I am no liar. You will answer, to the best of your ability, such questions as they shall put. You will also write on such theme as they shall select. In their eyes, it appears, I hold the position of an unprincipled impostor. I write essays, and, with deliberate forgery, sign to them my pupils' names, and boast of them as their work. You will disprove this charge." Grand ciel! Here was the show trial, so long evaded, come on me like a thunderclap. These two fine, braided, mustachioed, sneering personages were none other than dandy professors of the college, Messieurs Boissec and Rochemort, a pair of cold-blooded fops and pedants, skeptics and scoffers. It seems that Monsieur Paul had been rashly exhibiting something I had written, something he had never once praised, or even mentioned in my hearing, and which I deemed forgotten. The essay was not remarkable at all. It only seemed remarkable compared with the average productions of foreign schoolgirls. In an English establishment it would have passed scarce noticed. Messieurs Boissec and Rochemort had thought proper to question its genuineness, and insinuate a cheat. I was now to bear my testimony to the truth, and to be put to the torture of their examination. A memorable scene ensued. They began with classics, a dead blank. They went on to French history. I hardly knew Mérovée from Peremonde. They tried me in various ologies, and still got only a shake of the head, and an unchanging je n'en sais rien. After an expressive pause, they proceeded to matters of general information, broaching one or two subjects which I knew pretty well, and on which I had often reflected. Monsieur Emmanuel, who had hitherto stood looking on, dark as the winter solstice, brightened up somewhat. He thought I should now show myself at least no fool. He learned his error. Though answers to the questions surged up fast, my mind filling like a rising well, ideas were there, but not words. I either could not, or would not speak, I am not sure which. Partly, I think, my nerves had got wrong, and partly my humour was crossed. I heard one of my examiners, he of the braided surtout, whisper to his co-professor, "Est-elle donc idiote?" Yes, I thought, an idiot she is, and always will be, for such as you. But I suffered cruelly. I saw the damps gather on Monsieur Paul's brow, and his eye spoke a passionate yet sad reproach. He would not believe in my total lack of popular cleverness. He thought I could be prompt, if I would. At last, to relieve him, the professors, and myself, I stammered out, "Gentlemen, you had better let me go. You will get no good of me. As you say, I am an idiot." I wish I could have spoken with calm and dignity, or I wish my sense had sufficed to make me hold my tongue. That traitor tongue tripped, faltered. Beholding the judges cast on Monsieur Emmanuel a hard look of triumph, and hearing the distressed tremor of my own voice, out I burst in a fit of choking tears. The emotion was far more of anger than grief. Had I been a man and strong, I could have challenged that pair on the spot, but it was emotion, and I would rather have been scourged than betray it. The incapables! Could they not see at once the crude hand of a novice in that composition they called a forgery? The subject was classical. When Monsieur Paul dictated the trait on which the essay was to turn, I heard it for the first time. The matter was new to me, and I had no material for its treatment. But I got books, read up the facts, laboriously constructed a skeleton out of the dry bones of the real, and then clothed them, and tried to breathe into them life, and in this last aim I had pleasure. With me it was a difficult and anxious time till my facts were found, selected, and properly jointed. Nor could I rest from research and effort till I was satisfied of correct anatomy. The strength of my inward repugnance to the idea of flaw or falsity sometimes enabled me to shun egregious blunders, but the knowledge was not there in my head, ready and mellow. It had not been sown in spring, grown in summer, harvested in autumn, and garnered through winter. Whatever I wanted I must go out and gather fresh, glean of wild herbs my lapful, and shred them green into the pot. Messieurs Boissec and Rochemort did not perceive this. They mistook my work for the work of a ripe scholar. They would not yet let me go. I must sit down and write before them. As I dipped my pen in the ink with a shaking hand, and surveyed the white paper with eyes half blinded and overflowing,
one of my judges began mincingly to apologize for the pain he caused. "Nous agissons dans l'intérêt de la vérité. Nous ne voulons pas vous blesser," said he. Scorn gave me nerve. I only answered, "Dictate, monsieur." Rochemort named the theme, Human Justice. Human justice! What was I to make of it? Blank, cold abstraction, unsuggestive to me of one inspiring idea, and there stood Monsieur Emmanuel, sad as Saul, and stern as Joab, and there triumphed his accusers. At these two I looked. I was gathering my courage to tell them that I would neither write nor speak another word for their satisfaction, that their theme did not suit, nor their presence inspire me, and that, notwithstanding, whoever threw the shadow of a doubt on Monsieur Emmanuel's honour outraged that truth of which they had announced themselves the champions. I meant to utter all this, I say, when suddenly a light darted on memory. Those two faces, looking out of the forest of long hair, moustache, and whisker, those two cold yet bold, trustless yet presumptuous visages, were the same faces, the very same that, projected in full gaslight from behind the pillars of a portico, had half frightened me to death on the night of my desolate arrival in Villette. These, I felt morally certain, were the very heroes who had driven a friendless foreigner beyond her reckoning and her strength, chased her breathless over a whole quarter of the town. Pious mentors, thought I, pure guides for youth, if human justice were what she ought to be, you two would scarce hold your present post, or enjoy your present credit. An idea once seized, I fell to work. Human justice rushed before me in novel guise, a red, random beldame with arms akimbo. I saw her in her house, the den of confusion. Servants called to her for orders or help which she did not give. Beggars stood at her door waiting and starving unnoticed. A swarm of children, sick and quarrelsome, crawled round her feet, and yelled in her ears appeals for notice, sympathy, cure, redress. The honest woman cared for none of these things. She had a warm seat of her own by the fire, she had her own solace in a short black pipe, and a bottle of Mrs. Sweeney's soothing syrup. She smoked and she sipped, and she enjoyed her paradise, and whenever a cry of the suffering souls about her pierced her ears too keenly, my jolly dame seized the poker or the hearth-brush. If the offender was weak, wronged, and sickly, she effectually settled him. If he was strong, lively, and violent, she only menaced, then plunged her hand in her deep pouch, and flung a liberal shower of sugar-plums. Such was the sketch of human justice, scratched hurriedly on paper, and placed at the service of Messieurs Boissec and Rochemort. Monsieur Emmanuel read it over my shoulder. Waiting no comment, I curtsied to the trio, and withdrew. After school that day, Monsieur Paul and I again met. Of course the meeting did not at first run smooth. There was a crow to pluck with him. That forced examination could not be immediately digested. A crabbed dialogue terminated in my being called une petite moqueuse et sans cœur, and in Monsieur's temporary departure. Not wishing him to go quite away, only desiring he should feel that such a transport as he had that day given way to could not be indulged with perfect impunity, I was not sorry to see him, soon after, gardening in the berceau. He approached the glass door. I drew near also. We spoke of some flowers growing round it. By and by Monsieur laid down his spade. By and by he recommenced conversation, passed to other subjects, and at last touched a point of interest. Conscious that his proceeding of that day was specially open to the charge of extravagance, Monsieur Paul half apologized. He half regretted, too, the fitfulness of his moods at all times, yet he hinted that some allowance ought to be made for him. "But," said he, "I can hardly expect it at your hands, Miss Lucy. You know neither me, nor my position, nor my history." His history. I took up the word at once. I pursued the idea. "Non, monsieur," I rejoined. "Of course, as you say, I know neither your history, nor your position, nor your sacrifices, nor any of your sorrows, or trials, or affections, or fidelities. Oh no, I know nothing about you. You are for me altogether a stranger." "Hein?" he murmured, arching his brows in surprise. "You know, monsieur. I only see you in class. stern, dogmatic, hasty, imperious. I only hear of you in town as active and wilful, quick to originate, hasty to lead, but slow to persuade, and hard to bend. A man like you, without ties, can have no attachments, without dependence, no duties. All we with whom you come in contact are machines, which you thrust here and there, inconsiderate of their feelings. You seek your recreations in public, by the light of the evening chandelier. This school and yonder college are your workshops, where you fabricate the ware called pupils. I don't so much as know where you live. It is natural to take it for granted that you have no home, and need none."
"I am judged," said he. "Your opinion of me is just what I thought it was. For you I am neither a man nor a Christian. You see me void of affection and religion, unattached by friend or family, unpiloted by principle or faith. It is well, mamselle. Such is our reward in this life."
"You are a philosopher, monsieur, a cynic philosopher." And I looked at his paletot, of which he straightway brushed the dim sleeve with his hand, "despising the foibles of humanity, above its luxuries, independent of its comforts."
Et vous, mamselle, vous êtes proprette et douillette, et affreusement insensible, par-dessus le marché.
"But in short, monsieur, now I think of it, you must live somewhere. Do tell me where, and what establishment of servants do you keep?" With a fearful projection of the underlip, implying an impetus of scorn the most decided, he broke out, "Je vis dans un trou. I inhabit a den, miss, a cavern where you would not put your dainty nose. Once, with base shame of speaking the whole truth, I talked about my study in that college. Know now that this study is my whole abode. My chamber is there, and my drawing-room. As for my establishment of servants," mimicking my voice, "they number 10. Les voilà." And he grimly spread, close under my eyes, his 10 fingers. "I black my boots," pursued he savagely. "I brush my paletot." "No, monsieur, it is too plain. You never do that," was my parenthesis. "Je fais mon lit et mon ménage. I seek my dinner in a restaurant. My supper takes care of itself. I pass days laborious and loveless, nights long and lonely. I am ferocious and bearded and monkish, and nothing now living in this world loves me, except some old hearts worn like my own, and some few beings, impoverished, suffering, poor in purse and in spirit, whom the kingdoms of this world own not, but to whom a will and testament not to be disputed has bequeathed the kingdom of heaven." "Ah, monsieur, but I know."
"What do you know? Many things, I verily believe, yet not me, Lucy."
"I know that you have a pleasant old house, in a pleasant old square of the Basse Ville. Why don't you go and live there?"
"Hein?" muttered he again.
"I liked it much, monsieur, with the steps ascending to the door, the grey flags in front, the nodding trees behind, real trees, not shrubs, trees dark, high, and of old growth, and the boudoir oratoire. You should make that room your study. It is so quiet and solemn." He eyed me closely. He half smiled, half colored.
"Where did you pick up all that? Who told you?" he asked.
"Nobody told me. Did I dream it, monsieur, do you think?"
"Can I enter into your visions? Can I guess a woman's waking thoughts, much less her sleeping fantasies?"
"If I dreamt it, I saw in my dream human beings as well as a house. I saw a priest, old, bent, and grey, and a domestic, old too, and picturesque, and a lady splendid but strange. Her head would scarce reach to my elbow. Her magnificence might ransom a duke. She wore a gown bright as lapis lazuli, a shawl worth 1,000 francs. She was decked with ornaments so brilliant, I never saw any with such a beautiful sparkle, but her figure looked as if it had been broken in two and bent double. She seemed also to have outlived the common years of humanity, and to have attained those which are only labour and sorrow. She was become morose, almost malevolent, yet somebody, it appears, cared for her in her infirmities. Somebody forgave her trespasses, hoping to have his trespasses forgiven. They lived together, these 3 people, the mistress, the chaplain, the servant, all old, all feeble, all sheltered under one kind wing." He covered with his hand the upper part of his face, but did not conceal his mouth, where I saw hovering an expression I liked.
"I see you have entered into my secrets," said he. "But how was it done?"
So I told him how, the commission on which I had been sent, the storm which had detained me, the abruptness of the lady, the kindness of the priest. As I sat waiting for the rain to cease, Père Silas whiled away the time with a story, I said.
"A story? What story? Père Silas is no romancist."
"Shall I tell monsieur the tale?"
"Yes, begin at the beginning. Let me hear some of Miss Lucy's French, her best or her worst. I don't care which. Let us have a good poignée of barbarisms, and a bounteous dose of the insular accent."
"Monsieur is not going to be gratified by a tale of ambitious proportions, and the spectacle of the narrator sticking fast in the midst, but I will tell him the title, The Priest's Pupil."
"Bah!"
said he, the swarthy flush again dyeing his dark cheek.
"The good old father could not have chosen a worse subject. It is his weak point. But what of the priest's pupil?"
"Oh, many things."
"You may as well define what things. I mean to know."
"There was the pupil's youth, the pupil's manhood, his avarice, his ingratitude, his implacability, his inconstancy. Such a bad pupil, monsieur, so thankless, cold-hearted, unchivalrous, unforgiving."
"Et puis?"
said he, taking a cigar. "Et puis," I pursued, "he underwent calamities which one did not pity, bore them in a spirit one did not admire, endured wrongs for which one felt no sympathy, finally took the unchristian revenge of heaping coals of fire on his adversary's head."
"You have not told me all," said he.
"Nearly all, I think. I have indicated the heads of Père Silas's chapters."
"You have forgotten one, that which touched on the pupil's lack of affection, on his hard, cold, monkish heart."
"True. I remember now. Père Silas did say that his vocation was almost that of a priest, that his life was considered consecrated."
"By what bonds or duties?"
"By the ties of the past and the charities of the present."
"You have, then, the whole situation."
"I have now told monsieur all that was told me." Some meditative minutes passed.
"Now, Mademoiselle Lucy, look at me, and with that truth which I believe you never knowingly violate, answer me one question. Raise your eyes, rest them on mine, have no hesitation. Fear not to trust me. I am a man to be trusted."
I raised my eyes.
"Knowing me thoroughly now, all my antecedents, all my responsibilities, having long known my faults, can you and I still be friends?"
"If monsieur wants a friend in me, I shall be glad to have a friend in him."
"But a close friend, I mean, intimate and real, kindred in all but blood. Will Miss Lucy be the sister of a very poor, fettered, burdened, encumbered man?"
I could not answer him in words, yet I suppose I did answer him. He took my hand, which found comfort in the shelter of his. His friendship was not a doubtful, wavering benefit, a cold, distant hope, a sentiment so brittle as not to bear the weight of a finger. I at once felt, or thought I felt, the support like that of some rock.
"When I talk of friendship, I mean true friendship," he repeated emphatically,
and I could hardly believe that words so earnest had blessed my ear. I hardly could credit the reality of that kind, anxious look he gave. If he really wished for my confidence and regard, and really would give me his, why it seemed to me that life could offer nothing more or better. In that case, I was become strong and rich. In a moment I was made substantially happy. To ascertain the fact, to fix it and seal it, I asked, "Is monsieur quite serious? Does he really think he needs me, and can take an interest in me as a sister?"
"Surely, surely," said he, "a lonely man like me, who has no sister, must be too glad to find in some woman's heart a sister's pure affection."
"And dare I rely on monsieur's regard? Dare I speak to him when I am so inclined?"
"My little sister must make her own experiments," said he. "I will give no promises. She must tease and try her wayward brother till she has drilled him into what she wishes. After all, he is no inductile material in some hands."
While he spoke, the tone of his voice, the light of his now affectionate eye, gave me such a pleasure as certainly I had never felt. I envied no girl her lover, no bride her bridegroom, no wife her husband. I was content with this my voluntary, self-offering friend. If he would but prove reliable, and he looked reliable, what, beyond his friendship, could I ever covet? But if it all melted like a dream, as once before had happened— "Qu'est-ce donc? What is it?" said he, as this thought threw its weight on my heart, its shadow on my countenance. I told him, and after a moment's pause, and a thoughtful smile, he showed me how an equal fear, lest I should weary of him, a man of moods so difficult and fitful, had haunted his mind for more than one day, or 1 month. On hearing this, a quiet courage cheered me. I ventured a word of reassurance. That word was not only tolerated, its repetition was courted. I grew quite happy, strangely happy, in making him secure, content, tranquil. Yesterday I could not have believed that earth held, or life afforded, moments like the few I was now passing. Countless times it had been my lot to watch apprehended sorrow close darkly in, but to see unhoped-for happiness take form, find place, and grow more real as the seconds sped, was indeed a new experience. "Lucy," said Monsieur Paul, speaking low, and still holding my hand, "did you see a picture in the boudoir of the old house?" "I did. A picture painted on a panel." "The portrait of a nun?" "Yes." "You heard her history?" "Yes." "You remember what we saw that night in the berceau?" "I shall never forget it." "You did not connect the two ideas. That would be folly." "I thought of the apparition when I saw the portrait," said I, which was true enough. "You did not, nor will you fancy," pursued he, "that a saint in heaven perturbs herself with rivalries of earth. Protestants are rarely superstitious. These morbid fancies will not beset you." "I know not what to think of this matter, but I believe a perfectly natural solution of this seeming mystery one day will be arrived at." "Doubtless, doubtless. Besides, no good living woman, much less a pure, happy spirit, would trouble amity like ours, n'est-il pas vrai?" Ere I could answer, Fifine Beck burst in, rosy and abrupt, calling out that I was wanted. Her mother was going into town to call on some English family, who had applied for a prospectus. My services were needed as an interpreter. The interruption was not unseasonable. Sufficient for the day is always the evil. For this hour its good sufficed. Yet I should have liked to ask Monsieur Paul whether the morbid fancies, against which he warned me, wrought in his own brain. Chapter 35